Going forward, it's going to get trickier. The so-called last mile is going to get a lot trickier. We're not going to have the tailwinds that we had, and we're going to have some headwinds.
This is a key number. What will you be watching? And if the number comes in at 3.8% as expected, how should we react to that?
It is a key number, not just because of what it tells you about the economy, what it tells you about Fed policy. It also tells you about markets. It also has a political dimension and a social dimension. So it's among the most important numbers right now.
All eyes are on the latest Consumer Price Index release, which tells us whether inflation has continued on its path of improvement from the 9.1% highs set in the middle of 2022.
And the hope is that we're going to continue to see this smooth disinflation. So this report in particular should have core inflation coming down. Headline inflation would be a bit more sticky.
This interview was done just before the numbers came in, and he was right. Headline inflation in the US came in at 0.3% for the month, bringing the annual inflation for 2023 to 3.4%, slightly higher than expected. Core inflation, which excludes the volatile categories such as food and energy, also came in at 0.3% for an annual figure for 2023 of 3.9%. So core inflation did come down, continuing on its slow disinflationary path. But headline inflation actually rose somewhat on an annual basis.
Going forward, it's going to get trickier. The so-called last mile is going to get a lot trickier. We're not going to have the tailwinds that we had, and we're going to have some headwinds.
For over 12 months, in part thanks to the Federal Reserve's aggressive interest rate hikes, we saw inflation fall quickly from its highs to around 3% in June of last year. But since then, while core inflation has trended down, headline inflation has remained in that range, actually trending up somewhat. The generally agreed healthy range for inflation is 1 to 2%, and removing that last 1 to 2% of inflation is going to be the most difficult challenge, especially given the headwinds facing the economy in the beginning of this year.
So we're seeing further disruption on the supply side. What's happening in the Red Sea is significant.
Starting in December of 2023, a major supply chain disruption has been taking place. And despite it causing hundreds of billions of dollars in trade diversions, the coverage of this has mostly been background noise. Well, it has been background noise up until now, but I have a feeling you're about to hear a lot more about this issue as it begins to affect everyday people. A rebel organization in Yemen has been attacking shipping companies moving through the Red Sea. And to understand why this could cause a resurgence of inflation, I need to provide a little bit of context around the global shipping industry. In 2023, we live in a deeply interconnected global economy, with countries exchanging goods and services valued at over $25 trillion annually. And according to the OECD, about 80% of international trade is done via the ocean with ships. According to the UN, that number is actually as high as 90%. Quick side note, when I'm talking about specific numbers, I'm going to be giving a lot of ranges, and that's simply because I was looking at a bunch of different sources and specific estimates came in differently depending on where you look. So most trade is done via shipping routes, connecting country to country, and one of the biggest and most important routes is through the Red Sea, a narrow stretch of sea wedged between the Middle East and Africa. And if you zoom out on a map, you can very quickly understand why this passage is so important for global trade. It makes the trip between Asia and Europe in particular much faster than alternative routes, such as this route around Africa. Every year, about 12 to 15% of all global trade is routed through the Red Sea, which is about $3 to $4 trillion annually. The Red Sea is narrow, but there's also two even narrower choke points. At the top, there's the Suez Canal, which has had its own problems in the past, but at the bottom, there's the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. It's a very narrow 30-kilometer wide bottleneck sitting between Djibouti, which is an East African country, and Yemen. This particular choke point's importance to the global economy and the economies of the countries around it makes it very vulnerable to attack, which is what started happening last month. Introducing the Houthi rebels. They are a terrorist organization currently controlling about a third of Yemen's territory, and they've been attacking commercial ships moving through the Red Sea with missiles and drones. Over 100 missiles and drones have been fired at ships since the attacks began, directly targeting between 10 and 20 commercial ships. And they've mostly been ships that are Israeli owned or ships that are planning on porting in Israel. The Houthi attacks are happening as a part of the conflict happening between Israel and Palestine, with the rebels stating that they support Palestine and claim to be only targeting Israeli ships, but other ships moving through the strait have also been targeted. There's obviously an enormous amount of geopolitics attached to this issue. I'm just going to set that aside and leave that to the political commentators, and I'm just going to focus on the economic impact. The attacks have made it significantly more dangerous for ships to route through the Red Sea, and so the first economic shock that came was from increased insurance premiums for shipping companies taking this route. According to Reuters, before the attacks, a ship on average would have paid a premium of about 0.07% of the value of the ship. A week after the attacks began, that increased tenfold to 0.5 to 0.7%. And Bloomberg reported this week that premiums have risen to 0.75 to 1%, which might not seem like a lot, but it is once you realize how massive the value of these ships really are. A ship moving through the Red Sea might hold 10,000 40-foot containers, each with goods valued at around $50,000 each, which is $500 million of goods per ship. So what used to be a $350,000 insurance premium could now be as much as $5 million. As a result of the increased costs and risks, a lot of companies are choosing to divert their ships through other routes. They're now sending ships around the south of Africa, a route called the Cape of Good Hope. This is a significantly longer route. Depending on which countries are trading, it adds about 2,000 to 4,000 nautical miles to the journey. The weather conditions are also considerably worse, so ships generally have to move slower, leading to ships taking 1 to 3 weeks longer to reach their destinations. And trade between Europe and Asia is even worse because a lot of European ports actually depend on the Suez Canal. Longer distances and more time at sea means more fuel consumption, more labor hours, and therefore higher freight costs. Just a week after the attacks, CNBC reported that the rate of a 40-foot container from Shanghai, China to the UK had risen from $2,400 to about $10,000. In the space of just a few weeks, these shipping rates have fluctuated wildly, reflecting the volatility of the situation. Just last week, CNBC reported that routes from Asia to Northern Europe had doubled from $2,000 to $4,000 per container, and the supply shock is already rippling out across the globe. Air freight saw a 13% increase in the price per kilogram as demand has increased, and Egypt's economy is in crisis as less ships sailing through the Suez Canal means collecting less tolls. Companies pay $500,000 to $600,000 per ship to pass through the narrow passage.
If it persists, it will have a stagflationary impact.
It's hard to know how significant the economic impact will be because it largely depends on how long the attacks persist for. But what is obvious is the type of economic event it's creating: a supply shock. A sudden decrease in the supply causing a sudden increase in price. This has happened many times in the past, particularly around large global commodities like oil. Some event happens that hits the supply of oil, the price of oil spikes, and it ripples across the economy. Shipments cost more, flights cost more, trucking goods across the country cost more, and so businesses raise their prices to offset the higher costs. Supply shocks can also have a sort of stagflationary effect as well, where it's not just a rise in inflation, but an economic slowdown at the same time. The Red Sea crisis is literally slowing down one of the most important shipping routes in the global economy, so you could see prices for goods rise at the same time as a general slowdown in the economy.
Second, the base effects are not going to be working for you anymore.
When we talk about inflation, it's always a comparison between price levels last year to price levels this year. So there's kind of two different factors that go into the ultimate inflation figure. what happened to prices last year and what's happening to prices this year. In 2023, for example, we were comparing 2023 prices to the very high prices of 2022. So mathematically, the inflation figure was small. There's a ton of economic studies looking into this and how it plays a role in the fluctuations we see month by month and in annual inflation. They're called base effects. So when he says the base effects won't be working anymore, he means we don't have the high base prices of 2022 to compare to anymore. Some categories were even in deflation in 2023. Fuel oil, for example, declined 14.7%. A reversal in that, say due to supply shocks, could see inflation remain stickier.
And then third, there's a limit to how much goods disinflation we're going to get. We need to see services disinflation come down. So far, we've benefited because certain goods have been in outright deflation, and that has dragged the averages down. But we now need to see more on the service side, and the service side tends to be a little bit more sticky.
It's important to distinguish between deflation and disinflation. Deflation meaning prices are going down, disinflation meaning prices are still going up, but at a slower rate than previously. Apparel, used cars and vehicles, fuel oil, and gasoline are all goods that saw deflation in 2023. They helped drag the headline inflation rate down in a meaningful way. Services, on the other hand, still rose 5.3% in 2023. And that's mostly because services generally have higher labor expenses and prices are influenced more heavily by wage growth. So getting that last mile of inflation down is likely going to depend largely on continued declines in prices of goods, which again, if the current supply shock persists, may be more difficult than last year.
John Williams used the phrase yesterday, our longer term goal of 2%. It really matters what longer term means.
Yeah.
If it means a couple of years, then we will avoid another Fed policy mistake. If it means this year, then we risk sacrificing growth unduly.
The balancing act faced by the Fed is a really difficult one. On one hand, keeping rates too high for too long could tip the US into recession. And it's not just about raising rates too high. Rates may already be at an unsustainable level for many businesses and households. If you have savings or assets, you can last for a fair while with expenses higher than income before you really need to start cutting back. And given that the general sentiment is that rates are going to be cut, many people and businesses may be preparing for that environment, and therefore being less careful about how they spend. JP Morgan has been tracking the decline of household savings over the past year as people choose to tap into their savings rather than cutting back their lifestyle. In a recent report, they noted that conditions aren't nearly as bad as the GFC, in part because households had far more assets to their name than before the housing collapse. On the other hand, not tackling the last mile of inflation now could just lead to entrenched price expectations. People just getting used to prices rising at 3, 4, 5% per year and then trying to get ahead of it by making purchases now, and therefore obviously contributing to more inflation. El Arian doesn't seem overly concerned about a second inflation spike. His concern is that being too aggressive with interest rates could cause a recession. And if you liked this video, here's 2 other videos that I know you'll enjoy. And subscribe, because it's free. And why not? It helps grow my YouTube channel. And you can get notified when I post. Only if you want. You can hit the notification bell if you want. Okay, bye.